When I got married, what saved me was not telling my husband or his mother that the house belonged to me. When I got married, I believed I was joining my life with a man who valued my effort, my history, and my dreams. For years, I struggled alone to build every inch of the house where I lived. I never imagined that the very silence regarding this achievement would become my salvation. Amid smiles, promises, and gestures that seemed like love, I was slowly surrounded by a web of lies so well planned that I almost didn't notice. But even in the darkest moments, something inside me prevented me from giving up. What I experienced could have destroyed me, but it transformed me. Today, I look back with pride, knowing that my strength was not born from the absence of pain, but from the decision not to let it define me. If you have made it this far, it is because you know there is immense power in starting over. I am very happy to share my story with you. Follow it until the end and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. I want to know how far this message of courage and truth can reach. The call came while I was organizing medical records at the end of a tiring shift. The number was unknown, but I answered with a voice still soaked in exhaustion. The woman on the other end of the line introduced herself as an employee of M&R Real Estate and, with a rehearsed politeness, informed me about the scheduling for the sales appraisal of my house. In that same instant, I felt a sharp snap inside my chest. That made no sense. I would never put my house up for sale. My first impulse was to believe they were mistaken. I asked for the address, thinking perhaps it was another property, another client. But she confirmed, 274 Ainsley Street. My refuge. The house I fought for years. When I explained that I had not requested any appraisal, she hesitated for a brief moment. And that was when everything turned upside down. With the same formality, she said, "Your husband said you were aware of everything." My knees grew weak. I was speechless. Elijah? Had he authorized this? Did he have that right? Questions raced through my mind, but the attendant continued naturally, as if there were nothing abnormal. While she spoke about available dates and initial documentation, my hands were sweating and my breathing fluctuated between anger and disbelief. When I managed to interrupt her, I asked her not to proceed with anything. I needed time. Your husband said you were aware of everything. As I hung up, I felt the silence of the room swallow me. The hospital continued its rhythm, but inside me, everything had stopped. It wasn't just a call. It was an alert, a breach of trust. That was not normal. Elijah had mentioned absolutely nothing in the last few days. And even if it were some misunderstanding, why involve my name without telling me? On the way back home, every step seemed heavier. Something was about to collapse. Are you sure Mrs. Simmons doesn't want to sell? I arrived home trying to act normal. Elijah greeted me with the same smile as always, the same predictable routine. Nothing on his face betrayed that anything was wrong. I, on the other hand, felt every muscle in my body tense. The night passed with dinner, conversation, and television, as if nothing had happened. I observed his every word, every gesture. I couldn't act without understanding what was happening. Feigning serenity was my greatest challenge. Inside, my thoughts would not stop. I began to remember vague conversations, Diana's sudden proximity with questions about the house, and the haste with which Elijah insisted on handling bills and documents. But everything was always wrapped in smiles, promises, and a false security. Had he really authorized a real estate agency to appraise the house? What would be the next step? That call revealed only the tip of something much larger. That night, lying next to him, I had to control my breathing so as not to sob. Fear, which I had never allowed to live with me, now sat beside me on the bed. I needed to discover what was behind all this. But I also knew that if I showed any suspicion, they might act faster. I needed strategy and silence. For the first time in years, I had to distrust the person sleeping next to me. It was as if something ancient in me had awakened. An instinct that did not come from anger, but from self-protection. By hiding my reaction, I realized my intuition was guiding me. For the first time, I was lying not to deceive someone but to survive. That night marked a point of no return. It was the first time I lied out of instinct. That house was more than bricks and paint. It was the living proof of what silent sacrifice could build. I worked 2 shifts for 7 consecutive years without vacations, without weekends. I saved every cent, turned down invitations, sold things, and repaired old furniture. I bought the land when I was 24 years old, And little by little, I raised the walls one room at a time. I painted the facade myself with my own hands. Nothing in that house came easily. I remember the day I slept in it for the first time. A mattress on the floor, the smell of fresh cement, but in pride impossible to explain. There, without furniture or comfort, I felt complete. I knew I was building something that was mine alone, that no one could take away. It was more than a house. It was my biography materialized. No external applause mattered to me. Every detail had a story. Every corner represented a sacrifice of mine. For years I avoided serious relationships. I didn't want to share with anyone what I hadn't even finished yet. But loneliness sometimes felt heavy. It was during this interval that Elijah appeared. Polite, handsome kind. He brought me flowers on our second date and said he admired my strength. He seemed to respect my independence. And perhaps that was what disarmed me. For the first time, I believed I could share what I built without losing anything. But there was a moment, a small one that today shines like a beacon in my memory. We were sitting in the living room and he quite naturally asked, "Who owns this house anyway?" It was a common question asked in a light tone, but something chilled me inside. Without thinking, I replied that it was rented. He just nodded. He didn't insist. And that made me even more suspicious. No one gave me anything. Every brick has my sweat. After that, I tried not to think about it much. Elijah continued to be affectionate, and the relationship progressed quickly. I let myself be carried away, believing that I deserved a light story after so much struggle. But that moment when he asked about the house never left me. It was like invisible dust over everything we lived. Something told me that if he knew the truth, he wouldn't look at me the same way. So I kept the lie. I began to observe his questions, his comments. He showed an unusual interest in financial matters and documents, and he always returned to praising the size of the lot, the finish of the kitchen, and the structure of the roof. It was too much praise for a man who said he didn't care about material goods. And then I realized, he didn't praise the house out of politeness. He was appraising it, measuring, calculating. That wasn't love. It was a risk analysis. One afternoon talking to Nina, I briefly mentioned my suspicion. She laughed, thinking I was paranoid. But later her gaze changed. If you felt something, pay attention. Intuition is not nonsense, she said. Since then, I began to notice the obvious in disguise. The way Diana was always interested in the house, how Elijah avoided talking about contracts, and how he stayed close when I paid bills online. Returning to that lie now, days after the call from the real estate agency, was like revisiting a secret shelter. It was the first deviation from the truth I had made, and perhaps the most necessary one. If he had known from the beginning that the house was entirely mine, perhaps he wouldn't still be here to tell this story. It was a silent protection, a defense built in seconds which now seemed like an entire shield. He asked me who the owner of the house was, and I lied. Today, with everything I know, that lie takes on a new weight. It wasn't just a reflection of distrust, but a measure of survival. I couldn't explain it at the time, but something in me knew that Elijah wasn't just charm and good manners. There was a hunger for control, an ambition disguised as affection. Lying was my way of maintaining distance even while being close. It was my way of testing the ground before giving myself completely. If I had told the truth, I would have handed everything over on a silver platter. He would have approached in another way, perhaps faster, more engaging, more devastating. But my reserve forced him to work for something he didn't even know was real. This gave me time. And time, I now realize, was my greatest ally. It allowed me to see the cracks through which the truth escaped. And seeing is always the first step to resisting. I remember his look when he commented that houses like this don't appear twice. It was a compliment but also a kind of message. Elijah didn't see value in me. He saw value in what I had. And perhaps that is why he approached so quickly, so sneakily. The lie about the house created an invisible limit between us, and he never knew that this limit saved me. Today, I understand that truth and silence sometimes blend together. That protecting a truth may require disguising it. And that not every lie is a betrayal. Some are armor. Some are what prevent us from being destroyed. If I had told the truth, perhaps everything would have been lost. After Elijah officially asked me to be his girlfriend, the relationship moved forward like a calm hurricane. He appeared with flowers, prepared dinners, and picked me up from work on rainy days. Everything was planned to seem spontaneous. The affection was constant, almost suffocating, as if he needed to prove all the time how much he wanted me. In less than 6 months, he appeared with a ring and a marriage proposal. The proposal came on an ordinary weekend without luxury, but full of carefully chosen words. "I want to protect everything we built together, Rachel. We deserve security." That was what he said, holding my hands firmly. Caught by surprise, I said I needed to think. My heart oscillated between enchantment and a whisper of alert that insisted on visiting me in the early hours of the morning. In the following days, Elijah remained patient but anxious. He began to talk about life plans, children, and trips, always with an enchanting tone. But there was something behind it. He insisted on saying that together we could manage everything more easily. It wasn't just love. It was a need to join lives through paper and contracts. And at that point, true love begins to lose its shine. He said he wanted to protect what we built together. Even so, I said yes. I wanted to believe in the best. I wanted to rest a bit from the distrust. I thought perhaps the problem was with me, in my difficulty to trust. However, with the engagement came new presences, and the most striking was Diana, his mother. A cold woman with a gaze that measured me in silence. The house seemed to be her greatest area of interest. She asked if we were already thinking about selling. Diana began to visit our house with disconcerting frequency. Always elegant, she would sit with a contained smile and eyes attentive to every detail of the property. She praised the floor, the structure, the facade, but never commented on me. Sometimes she walked through the rooms alone, as if inspecting something that belonged to her. That bothered me deeply, although I tried to hide it. One day, during afternoon coffee, she turned to me and said, "This house is excellent for investment. Have you two thought about selling it while it's valued high?" My cup trembled between my fingers. Elijah gave a light laugh and said we were doing very well there, that there was no reason to sell. But Diana continued to stare, with a smile on her lips and ice in her eyes. I could barely finish my coffee. That night, I went back to dreaming about the house falling to pieces. A recurring nightmare from the time of construction. But now what was crumbling wasn't concrete, it was trust. I began to feel that there was a choreography in progress. Elijah and Diana did not move like an ordinary mother and son. There were secrets between them. And perhaps I was at the center of a plan I still didn't understand. I started to notice the small exchanges of glances, the complicit silences, and even wanting to believe it was just my paranoia. Something inside me began to scream. Those compliments about the house, that disguised sales proposal, were not random comments. They were probes. Attempts to measure how far they could go. They were more interested in the house than in me. It was on a rainy morning that I heard it. Elijah and Diana thought I was still sleeping, but I got up to drink water. As I passed through the hallway, I noticed the office door ajar and the low voices of the two. I stopped by instinct and Diana's words came clearly. "She will sign, trust you." My heart froze. I had no idea what they were talking about, but I knew it was something I wasn't supposed to hear. I retreated carefully, holding my breath, and went back to the room as if I were a prisoner in my own home. I lay in bed trying to decipher what that meant. They were talking about me, clearly. About something I would sign, convinced by Elijah. But what? A contract? A fake document? The possibilities suffocated me. And even in panic, I realized that I now needed to act. I spent the next few days pretending everything was normal. But the seed of doubt was planted and took root quickly. My eyes searched for clues, my mind scavenged through recent memories. And the more I observed, the more I noticed the strange gestures, the forced smiles, the sudden disappearances of Elijah. Something was in motion. And I needed to know what it was before they cast me as an extra in my own life. "She will sign, trust you." I turned to the only person I knew wouldn't judge me, Nina. She was always practical, centered, and had access to records that could help. I told her everything I knew and asked her to investigate any document with my name, especially those of a legal nature. The next day, she called me with an apprehensive voice. "There is nothing official yet, but there is a draft of a power of attorney in progress. Prepared. Just waiting for a signature." They already had everything prepared. I sat in the back seat of Nina's car and stared at the paper she had printed. There was my name. My digital signature had not yet been inserted, but the content was clear, giving him irreversible powers. The document was ready, waiting for me, innocent, to sign. My eyes burned. The world turned slowly as I absorbed it. They had a plan, and that plan involved taking from me what it took me years to conquer. Nina held my hand tightly. "You need a lawyer, Rachel. And fast." That was no longer just a suspicion. It was a scam in progress. And I was the final piece they needed to fit in. But I would not fall. For the first time, I felt a raw strength, like a clean fury that is born from fear transformed into action. I refused to be a victim. That night, I recovered all my documents, hid the originals in a safe place, and began to plan with coldness. It wasn't enough to escape. I needed to prove what they were doing. I needed someone who understood legal traps and who was on my side. That was when I remembered Samuel Reed, a lawyer Nina knew for having worked on fraud cases. I would seek him out. While Elijah slept, I wrote in my notebook, "They want my signature. But now they are going to have to deal with my resistance." There was no more room for illusions. Only for strategy. Only for truth. And for that, I needed to gather evidence. In time. I needed evidence. In time. Samuel Reed received me in his office with a firm handshake and a look that already knew difficult stories. Nina briefly explained what I was facing, and he prepared to investigate with urgency. In 2 days, he returned with information that took my breath away. Elijah and Diana had a history of fraud, cases dismissed for lack of evidence, and a list of women who lost more than assets. They lost their dignity. Samuel showed me documents, old testimonies, and reports registered in notary offices in 2 different cities. The two acted as a trained duo. Elijah would seduce, involve, and ask for a union of assets or disguised signatures. Diana would enter the scene as the affectionate, advising mother, a false mentor. After they got what they wanted, they disappeared. And all of this had happened more than once. I was not the first. I felt my stomach churn. The betrayal I imagined to be personal was, in fact, a pattern. A script of destruction. Elijah didn't love me. He never did. He studied me, chose me, and prepared me. Like prey. Diana was the architect and he was the executor. Samuel's words still echo in me. They don't just want your house, Rachel. They want to destabilize your life, your identity. It was deeper than I imagined. I left the office without ground beneath my feet, with my chest on fire. Now I knew who I was dealing with. And this truth was like an earthquake inside me. It wasn't just bad faith or interest. It was professional malice. Scammers of lives. They have already destroyed other women. Returning home after that was torture. But I needed to pretend. I couldn't raise suspicions. Elijah was in the kitchen, smiling, preparing tea. He kissed me on the forehead as if he were a loving husband. I swallowed the disgust and smiled back. The mask on my face was beginning to feel heavy. My every move was calculated. I needed to seem natural. But inside, something in me had already died. In the following days, I maintained the routine. I smiled, hugged, talked, and laughed at times. Everything on autopilot. I knew that if I showed anything, he would notice. And I couldn't risk it. The lie was now my ally. While they feigned love, I feigned ignorance. Every step inside that house was a rehearsal. Every night lying next to him a silent torture. Faking love while knowing they were plotting my end was the greatest test of my sanity. Elijah talked about plans, marriage, and parties, and I responded with fake enthusiasm. But inside I was arming myself. Every word of his was a map. Every smile from Diana a signal. And I continued collecting every movement, every strange behavior, like someone putting together pieces of a macabre puzzle. Nothing was spontaneous anymore. Nothing was safe. Everything was a risk. I had to protect myself and my history. Every smile was an act of survival. On a silent night, when Elijah went out to the grocery store, I used his password to access the email on his laptop. I knew there was something there. My heart beat out of sync, my hands trembled, but I went on. I searched through folders and documents, and finally I found it. A folder named Progress. Inside there were emails with notes, dates, document simulations, and my name written several times. I read line by line, and one phrase cut me. New target identified. Process similar to previous ones. It wasn't a conversation between a couple. It was an operation. Elijah and Diana called me a target. They discussed deadlines, strategies, and even possibilities for accelerating the process. The power of attorney plan was already in its final stage. I was just the next victim in a sequence of silent crimes. The messages came from an email with a fake name, but with Diana's standard signature. A pattern of language that was almost corporate. They treated fraud like business. I wanted to scream, but I swallowed the despair. Now I had evidence. Fragmented but real. And the most terrifying part was that they were still smiling at me. Still saying they loved me. With every click, I discovered another layer of cruelty. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a moral lapse. It was a scheme. Professional, cold, calculated. Now it wasn't personal. It was a scheme. After we saw the emails, Nina and I knew what we had to do. Words would not be enough. We needed something that could not be denied. Audios caught in the act, undeniable evidence. It was she who suggested installing discrete recording devices. We hid one behind the living room mirror and another in the office lamp. With every click of the recording, I felt I was getting closer to liberation. The first few days were frustrating. The conversations were common, careful, without direct mention of the scam. But one afternoon, while I pretended to sleep in the room, I heard Diana say, "Don't worry, she will sign at Sunday's dinner." Elijah responded with a muffled laugh and added, "She trusts me." That was recorded. The audio was clear. And there was the confirmation we were missing. Hearing it with my own ears was like being pushed out of my own body. It was cruel. But it was also necessary. Finally, I had something that dismantled any lie. Samuel listened to the recordings and said firmly, "Now it is time to turn the tables." And that was exactly what we began to do. "Don't worry, she will sign at Sunday's dinner." Samuel suggested a risky move. Creating a reverse power of attorney that simulated the delivery of assets to Elijah, but with hidden clauses that protected my property. I would sign in front of them symbolically, but the actual documents would be registered with null validity. They would think they had one. But in truth, they would be trapped in their own snare. I spent nights studying every term of the document. I needed to understand everything. The plan involved intelligence, courage, and, most importantly, self-control. On Sunday, I acted as if everything were in perfect harmony. I wore my best dress and prepared the table with care. Elijah was radiant. Diana did not hide her pride. And I was a silent minefield. They fell into the trap without realizing it. With the evidence gathered, all that was left was to close the circle. Samuel knew the case would gain strength if we showed that I was not the first. We contacted 2 of Elijah's ex-wives and an ex-fiancé, all deceived in the past. We managed to gather the contacts and schedule separate meetings. They were scarred by the experiences, but they did not hesitate to help. Finally, the loneliness I felt began to dissipate. Lynette, Chelsea, and Vivian. Each one brought documents, old messages, and forgotten records which now would have value. Their stories repeated with nuances. Elijah used the same script with small variations. Diana was always an active part. Their pain echoed mine. But we were also united by a strength that is only born from shared pain. They didn't want revenge. They wanted justice. On the day of the final meeting, I looked at them sitting before me and felt that something was changing. We were no longer victims. We were survivors. Each one with her scars, now added to my truth a chorus that was impossible to ignore. Samuel was impressed by the consistency of the reports and the strength of the records. The case, previously isolated, was now an exposed pattern. Little was left. We were about to take all of this to court. But first we would need to face the most difficult moment, looking them in the eyes and showing that we were no longer under their control. They were ready to testify. The day arrived. It was as if the world were holding its breath with me. The meeting room in Samuel's office was set up like a silent trench. We were there. I, Samuel, Nina, the 3 ex-wives, and also the civil police officers discreetly positioned. When Elijah entered, smiling, and Diana right behind him with her haughty air, I felt a knot in my stomach. They didn't know what awaited them. Their ignorance was almost theatrical. Samuel greeted them with dry politeness. He asked them to sit down. Elijah, unconcerned, pulled a chair up next to me. Diana gave me a tense smile. I did not return it. Samuel went straight to the point without beating around the bush. We have gathered some people today with similar stories. I believe you recognize them. It was then that the ex-wives entered. The air grew heavy. Elijah turned pale. Diana stiffened. Their false confidence began to crumble. They did not expect this. With calmness and precision, Samuel presented all the gathered documents. The emails I revealed, the audios of the conversations, the accounts of previous victims. Everything lined up like dominoes ready to fall. He showed the draft of the fake power of attorney, the dates that coincided with the reports of the other women, and the names used by Elijah in old schemes. Every item read was a nail in the coffin of the lie. While he spoke, I watched Diana's face lose color. Her hands trembled subtly. Elijah, on the contrary, dove into a gelid silence, of someone who understands he has been defeated. The looks between mother and son were now of panic, not strategy. And when Samuel stopped speaking, it was the police who stood up. They did not react. They did not scream. They did not deny. Diana's hands were trembling. Elijah remained in silence. The two were handcuffed right there in front of all of us. Elijah still tried to maintain his posture, but the tremor in his jaw betrayed him. Diana just lowered her eyes without a word. The metallic sound of the handcuffs was a symphony of justice. The other women cried softly. I stood still, motionless, feeling a strength ignite inside me. That was no longer just revenge, it was liberation. The officers led them away without fanfare. There was no attempt at resistance. The scene, though contained, was marked by an atmosphere of closure. The farce was over. Their game had ended. And now, before the law, everything would be exposed. I no longer needed to prove my pain with words. It was recorded in evidence, in testimonies, in raw truths. Nina hugged me tight when the door closed. I still wasn't crying. It was as if my body were in suspension, waiting for reality to catch up with me. The other women gathered with me in silence. A silence full of meaning. That room, which before caused me anxiety, was now a temple of resistance. Justice had begun to act. And I was no longer a victim. I was the author of my own defense. I was the last to leave the room. I looked at each empty chair and felt something change inside me. An old weight was lifted from my shoulders. For the first time in a long time, the truth was with me, not against me. It was no longer my word against theirs. It was the law. The news spread quickly. Couple arrested for attempted property fraud against nurse. The headline appeared on local sites, regional news, and even in neighborhood groups. The media wanted interviews, the neighborhood wanted details. But I kept quiet. I isolated myself within. I didn't want to retell the pain as if it were a spectacle. It still hurt too much. And most importantly, I didn't want my story to be reduced to a scandal. Journalists knocked at my door. My colleagues at work looked at me with disguised pity. Even distant relatives started calling me again. But I only wanted silence. The formal judicial process began days later. Samuel updated me with care, respecting my time. I only attended when it was strictly necessary. I sat on the witness stand and relived every detail with a firm voice, but a heart in ruins. Everyone wanted to hear my story, except me. During the trial, Elijah and Diana tried to maintain their facade. They claimed it was all a misunderstanding, that they never had bad intentions, and that they loved their family. But what they didn't know is that love does not survive evidence. And evidence was what we had in abundance. The prosecutor was relentless. He read excerpts from the emails out loud, presented the audios clearly, and showed the repetitive pattern of victims. The defense tried to shift the focus, but nothing worked. The witnesses were heard, including the ex-wives, with firmness and coherence. Their narrative fell apart with every new testimony. The judge remained attentive and serious. Every time Diana opened her mouth, she buried herself deeper. Elijah wouldn't even hold my gaze. When the prosecutor finished, the silence in the room was more eloquent than any argument. The prosecutor left no room for doubt. In the sentencing, the judge did not hesitate. Elijah and Diana were convicted of fraud, attempted larceny, and participation in a criminal organization. The magistrate's words were firm, almost liberating. Truth and justice have prevailed. Hearing this, I felt my chest expand. It wasn't about revenge. It was about closure. About showing that women like me can no longer be silenced. The impact of the conviction was great. The press continued covering it, but now with a tone of respect. The ex-wives sent me messages of gratitude. Nina cried on the phone. Samuel just said, "You won." And I knew I had. Not just for myself, but for all of us. For every woman who was manipulated, discredited, or used. It was the end of the empire of lies they built. I watched the final reading of the sentence with my head held high. I, who had once been called a target, was now the winner of the lawsuit. I became a symbol of resistance even without wanting to be. When I left the courthouse that day, the sky was clear. And for the first time in months, I felt that I was too. The truth was written in the record. Out loud. In an official tone. Now no one could erase it. Rachel Simmons innocent. Elijah and Diana Carter guilty. After the sentence, the house became more silent than ever. There were no more whispered lies nor false promises. But there was also no more strength. My body and my mind collapsed when it all ended. I spent weeks dragging myself along, without the will to get out of bed. I slept too much or not at all. Eating became an obligation. The void that remained was greater than the relief. Nina noticed before I could admit it. She appeared every day, even when I didn't open the door. She brought me tea, flowers, silence, and patience. She said that what I was feeling was natural, that the body only relaxes after the war. I wanted to believe it, but I felt weak for falling apart just now. I didn't cry during the process, but one memory, one smell was enough for me to break down. I cried for everything I hadn't cried for during the war. With time I began to leave the room. First just to the porch. Then for short walks. On one of these walks I stopped at a bookstore and saw a title that talked about emotionally betrayed women. Something in me ignited. I bought a new notebook and began to write. Short vents. Reflections. And suddenly the idea emerged. To create an anonymous blog to share my story, and perhaps read others. In less than a month, the blog already had dozens of hits. I received messages from women all over the country. Some told of their pain. Others asked for advice. And there, behind that screen, I began to find my strength again. Writing, organizing content about how to identify emotional scams, how to protect documents, and how to listen to one's own body. Every email I received was a mirror of my pain. The blog grew faster than I imagined. What began as a personal diary became a space for support, information, and collective strength. I started studying more about the psychology of abuse, women's rights, and property laws. I wanted to understand everything. I wanted to offer more than comfort, I wanted to offer prevention. The pain could not have been in vain. I needed to transform all of this into something bigger. That was when I received an email from Samuel. He said he had been invited to a legal seminar on property crimes and thought of me as a speaker. First, I hesitated. Speaking in public scared me. Exposing myself felt like reliving everything all over again. But he insisted. "You aren't going to speak about the pain, Rachel. You are going to speak about your strength." That phrase kept drumming in my mind for days. I accepted. I went up on stage trembling but firm. I shared my story with professionals, students, and women of all ages. And I realized that the shame I feared did not exist. In its place, there was admiration, identification, and respect. At the end of the lecture, dozens of people came to hug me. Some were crying. Others were just holding my hand tightly. I had broken the cycle of silence. After the first lecture, others came. Invitations from schools, NGOs, and events. My story was gaining a voice, and it was no longer just mine. It was ours. It belonged to all who have ever been silenced, to all who needed to hear. My voice was now a shield for others. With the blog established and the lectures gaining space, I felt that something more definitive was missing. Something that would eternalize my journey. I spent months writing, rewriting, and crying between one sentence and another. And then the book was born, Emotional Scam. The Danger Lives at Home. It wasn't just about me. It was about patterns, alerts, and real stories. It was a denunciation with a soul. The publisher embraced the project with courage. The launch was discreet but powerful. Women came to thank me, saying they recognized themselves in me. Others said they were still trying to get out. And, among everyone, a common feeling, relief at not being alone. When I held the printed book for the first time, I felt something close inside me. A cycle of pain transformed into words. I never again doubted my intuition. I was invited for a live interview on a local television program. I accepted with serenity. There was no longer any fear. Sitting before the cameras, I told my story from beginning to end, without embellishments. And at the end, the host asked me if I felt that justice had been done. I replied firmly yes. And more than that, they lost the right to exploit the future of other people. Then I revealed, for the first time in public, the most recent judicial decision. Because of the conviction for fraud and organized crime, Elijah and Diana legally lost the right to exercise any business, property, or contractual activity for the next 20 years. Their accounts were blocked, and future assets were already under monitoring. It wasn't just a punishment. It was the preventive ruin of those who once tried to destroy me. They didn't take anything from me. I took their future. The interview ended with a simple question. If you could summarize everything you lived through in one sentence, what would it be? I breathed deeply, looked at the camera, and let out what had long inhabited my heart. It was the motto I wrote at the top of my notebook on the first day of my new beginning. The phrase that guided my decisions, my silences, and my struggle. The phrase that today so many women repeat when reading my book or listening to my lectures. Caution is not weakness, it is not trauma, it is not a distrust of love. Caution is wisdom. Caution is a shield. The studio lights seemed softer. I felt that, in that moment, my purpose had been realized. Elijah and Diana were not only detained by justice, they were exposed by the truth. And I was healed by courage. Today, every page written, every woman alerted, every young person guided, is a new brick in an invisible house that I build with much more firmness than the first. A house of awareness, of empathy, of collective strength. And I protect it with everything I have. With my history, my voice, and my experience. Caution is not fear. It is survival. Now, I am curious about you who heard my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever gone through something similar? Support the channel, subscribe, like, comment, and share this video. I am leaving on the final screen another story that you will also like, and it will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching. Until the next video.